Okay, today we're going to be going through Chapter 8 of the Summa Logicae by William of Ockham. This chapter is called On the Third Mode of Concrete and Abstract Names. Okay, so he's going to start with a short conversation of abstract names as concrete names with syncagrammatic terms added in. So he gives a few examples, such as humanity actually just means all men, and greenness means all green things. Um, so what he's doing here is just showing us that what we mean by humanity is just a collection of a catagrammatic and a syncagrammatic term. It isn't actually a catagrammatic term in itself. And then he moves on to what could make two propositions or two terms non-identical or non-synonymous. So when predicating one of the other yields a false proposition, or when the things predicated of one are not necessarily predicable of the other. Okay. And then he gives us this answer to a problem from the last chapter, which is if there's no distinction between quantity and substance, why don't we have the issue of absurd sentences such as quantity is substance? And he says that if we understand the word quantity as necessarily quantified while remaining in the nature of things, then it just isn't the same as substance. Substance is necessarily, it would be absurd to say that substance is necessarily qualified while remaining in the nature of things. So he's just going to say if you define quantity in this way, then you define substance in a different way, then you aren't going to get them as synonymous. Um, and then he moves on to a short conversation of Avicenna uh, and Avicenna's comments on hoarseness. So the quote he pulls from Avicenna says, "Hoarseness is nothing more than hoarseness. For, by itself, it is neither one nor many, nor does it exist in sensible things, nor in the soul." So, what Ockham takes Avicenna to be saying here is that hoarseness does not include these things in its definition. Uh, there's nothing in the term horse which implies it is either one or many. There's nothing in the definition which implies that it exists in a sensible thing or in the soul. This isn't to say that it couldn't be, that specific horses couldn't be one or there couldn't be multiple horses. That isn't to say there couldn't exist physical horses or sensible horses, or that horses couldn't exist in some form in the intellect. But what he is saying is that none of these things are in the definition of hoarseness. And then he moves on to a strange conversation of what he takes to be an invalid form of argument. The form of argument runs as follows: every A is B, every C is B, therefore every C is A. And he says this is intuitively fine, but that if you put in certain premises, you're going to get a false conclusion. So every man is an animal. The necessarily risible thing is man, and therefore the necessarily risible thing is animal. And he says this is a false conclusion, and therefore this form of argument must be false. And then finally, there is a short discussion of how two expressions that have entirely different grammatical forms could actually signify the exact same thing. So they would just be two very different ways of stating the same underlying proposition. So the generation of form occurs in an instant, and no part of a form comes to be before another, but all come to be together. And these are entirely different grammatical forms, but they express the same underlying truth or proposition that is the same in both of them. They signify the same thing. That's going to be all for this episode.